first question, does Buddhism have a scientific basis? And then there was a follow-up question right after that. If so, are there any Buddhist sutras or Buddhist teachings that align very closely with some modern scientific findings? To answer this question, I think we first have to understand what this person means by scientific basis. We could ask, well, what is science? If something uses the scientific method, then it's scientific. So the scientific method includes observation or a question about something, research, followed by some sort of hypothesis. What could the answer be to this question? And then testing, experimentation, often a lot of experimentation, not just one test, but maybe hundreds of tests or 1,000 tests in order for us to get an idea. Is something a consistent rule, or is this just a chance happening? And then there's analysis. After we analyze and look at the results, then we report them and often report them to other scientists who can help us evaluate them. There's a discipline to the way that we look at problems, question them, and then go about trying to resolve them. And it's a communal thing. It's not just one person in a vacuum doing some science by themselves. If you do often read scientific articles, you may find that peer review is very important. It's important to have other professionals look at the conclusions you come to so that you can be challenged, or we can be challenged and learn from, maybe we're doing this experiment not correctly, or maybe we analyze something incorrectly. What about Buddhism? Does Buddhism have this kind of scientific approach to dealing with suffering? I think yes. In general, Buddhism involves a lot of reason, logic, experiment, coming to conclusions, and then getting feedback in order to know what is it that we're experiencing. The heart of Buddhist practice is not just about believing in something. And it's not even just about having a very thorough philosophy about something. Buddhism does have a lot of, if you go deep into it, a lot of complicated, very subtle theories, which some seem to contradict. And some Buddhist teachers throughout the generations openly debate with each other because they have contradicting viewpoints. It's all part of Buddhism, but who's right? Who's got the full answer? I actually don't think anyone has the complete answer in terms of theory or philosophy, but that, again, the teachings of Buddhism are like a map, and we use them to engage in a scientific approach to dealing with our own suffering. Let's see, did the Buddha use the scientific method, even though back then there was no such terminology? But the Buddha had a question. He knew there was a lot of suffering in the world, and he himself experienced suffering. And he was wondering, why do we suffer? What's the cause? And is there a way to get out of it? Is there a way to go beyond suffering? He had this question. And did he do research? Well, back then there probably weren't volumes of literature on the issue of suffering, but there were many other traditions in India. Like the Vedic tradition had already existed for quite some time. And the Buddha was well educated, he was well learned, but eventually he found that these things did not resolve his problem. So he went and studied with meditation masters. And he studied all kinds of meditation, which focused mostly on samadhi, deep concentration. But I'm jumping ahead. Before we get to practice, I'm sure the Buddha did his research to try to get answers, asked people he knew, why do humans suffer? How can we get past it? Within the Nikayas, or the Agama scriptures of the Buddha's teaching, he tells a bit about his story, about his process. And he did have some hypothesis that we suffer because we don't have clarity about suffering. I think that was a kind of hypothesis he had. Why do we suffer? Well, because we're not clear about it. We're not clear about suffering. We're not clear about reality. We must be confused. But he wasn't sure. That was his hypothesis. And did he do testing? It's like, yes, he did testing, but he tested himself. He did the experiments on himself. That's when he went to study with various meditation masters, various wise people, and communities of these practitioners who would spend a lot of time on looking inwards and developing deep concentration. But the Buddha, after having some experiences, he realized that that experience didn't resolve his suffering, didn't resolve the agitation, the uncertainty in his mind. So he analyzed. You could say he, by reflecting on his own experience, that's a kind of analysis. Well, I was in meditation the other day and it was blissful. Now I'm out of meditation and that bliss is gone. Or that deep silence, that deep spaciousness of the mind that I experienced the other day. Where is that now? It's gone. So he analyzed and he also asked his teachers. His teachers, many of them said, "This is all I have to teach you. There's nothing else I can show you." So the Buddha not only reported his own experiences and conclusions, he got feedback from his peers, he got feedback from his teachers, but it didn't solve the question. So he continued this scientific approach. He continued to look for answers and testing on himself, continuing to test. Test meaning he would experiment through sitting meditation. He would experiment through being aware of himself in day-to-day life as he was in solitude in the forest. Would you say this is scientific? I think it seems to fit the criteria of the scientific method. All those steps are there. Except he didn't, I think by modern standards, he didn't have 1,000 um, 1,000 test subjects where he could test this approach to meditation, to mindful living. He just had himself. However, Buddhism over how many years? 2,500 years has had thousands of people, thousands of so-called test subjects who applied the methodology of Buddhism, who did their own research into themselves, asked questions, consulted with peers, and came to the same conclusion that the Buddha came to. And they wrote their observations and conclusions. That's what the Shastras or the commentaries are in the Buddhist tradition. People not only studying the Buddha's teaching, but applying it, coming to their own conclusions, and speaking more about it, trying to give a more thorough description of the more basic description the Buddha gave. It's like the Buddha gave a simple map. People in later generations added more details. There's a road here, there's a side road here, there's a dead end here, don't go there. There may be other roads that loop around the main road that can also lead to the same destination. I think this is the richness of the Buddha's teaching, that there are generations of people who talked about the same insight in different ways, from different angles. There are some things about Buddhism and modern science that are clearly different, which is, as someone wrote here in the chat, does reality exist? Or maybe we can ask, does a completely objective reality exist out there and we need to somehow know it? Well, the unique thing about Buddhism is that Buddhism doesn't separate objective reality out there from the subjective reality or the subjective experience here. And what does that mean? Well, for example, in science, Scientists have to be very careful to attempt to be as objective as possible, meaning when they're studying studying a subject, they have to be careful not to put too many of their own personal interpretations or assumptions into the research experiment, which I think is impossible because as soon as we look at something, we immediately have a subjective experience of it. Two scientists looking through a microscope at the same thing actually see different things just based on the fact that they have two different pairs of eyes and different brain and they're a different person, different experiences, different cultural conditioning that makes them see what they see as different. So in science, there's an attempt to separate the subject, the scientist, from the object of analysis. Another way to talk about that more simply is that in the field of psychology, psychologists, when they're doing research and tests, they're testing other people. So I, the psychologist, am testing other people out there, and I'm doing analysis and evaluation uh, of their experience. I'm attempting to be separate from it, or I see myself as separate from it. Again, which is impossible from the Buddhist perspective, because the researcher themselves has so much within themselves that it naturally is going to affect what they see, how they analyze, and what conclusions they come to. Within Buddhist practice, the main difference is that the subject and the object of the experiment are one thing. We're our own subject of experiment, object of experiment. I am trying to understand my own suffering. I am trying to understand suffering. Within the Buddhist practice, as I learn more about suffering or my suffering, we come to realize that there's no separate subject and object. I is actually made of suffering. The sense of myself comes about because of suffering, or the sense of self is the source of suffering. So as we get more deeper into our observation of ourselves, we see there's no separation between some kind of observer, the me within, observing the body or thoughts. It's not like that. Rather, it's just one whole experience. No subject or object. There's just experiencing. There's feeling, there's thought, there's perception, there's seeing, there's hearing, but there's no self at the center. So this division between subject and object, that's important in the modern sciences. In this context of Buddhist practice, that doesn't apply. Another thing which is a bit different than the modern sciences is that Buddhist practice, experience, and insight is not limited to reason. It's not limited to reason or thinking or logic. What does that mean? Well, we still use thinking, we still use logic as a map to understand the direction of Buddhist practice. How do I meditate? How can I be mindful in my daily life? How can I speak to people and engage with people in a way that's compassionate? We need some reasoning. We need logic. We make use of it. But the actual experience of Buddhist practice and insight can never be described. Within Buddhism, we recognize that the reality that we experience directly is not something that can just be reported and captured in words and language and say, this is the truth of reality. Although Buddhist teachings attempt, in some cases, to describe what is not only suffering, but what is freedom from suffering like. The term nirvana is used to describe the freedom from suffering. And in certain contexts, the Buddha would often decline from describing, well, what is nirvana? What is the absence of suffering like? Right? The Buddha claimed to have been free from suffering. He claimed that he had an insight which freed his mind. What was it like? I'm sure everyone wanted to know. I'm sure many of us want to know. Some Buddhist teachings describe that, either in analogy or attempt to describe what is experienced. But most often, eventually, Buddhist teachings will say that no matter how it's described, we can never know it through knowledge or through intellect. That's a bit different. In certain scientific fields, a theory may be taken as a reality. But I think wise scientists realize that theories are just theories. They're attempts to understand. But the reality of the universe, whether it's expanding, whether it's contracting, whether it's both, that can never be known by the intellect. So Buddhism eventually goes beyond any conceptualization, and whether or not something can be proved, in the question that someone addressed or someone brought up when they asked, is Buddhism scientific, and what can it prove? As far as I know, many scientists don't like that word prove. They prefer the word evidence. There's evidence that something is likely. Something is likely true consistently, right? The theory of gravity. There are different theories and calculations that say it's likely true that gravity on Earth in all locations is like this. But maybe it's different at the top of a mountain, or maybe it's different with such and such location. I don't know. The proof is a tricky word. What is the proof that any of the theories of Buddhism are true at all, or even pointing to the truth? Well, that's something that we need to experience for ourselves. We need to experience directly. So the very famous saying of the Buddhist teachings, also like a finger pointing to the moon, comes from the Sutra on Complete Enlightenment. Someone points at the moon and we look at their finger. Keep looking at their finger. We're not going to see the moon for ourselves. Looking at the finger is like getting lost in theory, lost in concepts about what is real, what is reality, what is not reality. Getting lost in concepts, that's actually just more suffering. Looking at the moon is like experiencing. Experiencing, is it possible to not only know suffering, know the cause of suffering, and know it so thoroughly that we free ourselves from suffering? That's left to the individual to realize. Is it true or not? So this is also where Buddhism differs from science, in that we still need a kind of faith in Buddhism, a faith or confidence that it is possible to reduce our suffering, agitation, stress, anxiety, all of these forms of mental experience, psychological experience that are problematic, that can be resolved. That needs faith, right? Because we haven't experienced it ourselves yet. Even if we read it, how can we be sure? So there needs to be a certain amount of not knowing something, but knowing that it's possible, believing that it's possible. I think in science, just basing a conclusion on faith, or coming to a conclusion on faith and saying the results of our report is that, well, we didn't get the answer we were looking for. We couldn't prove it wrong. We couldn't prove it right, but we just have faith that it's probably right, or we have faith that it's going to be this way. That wouldn't be accepted as a as a probably as a suitable paper to be published, or anything that anyone would place any importance on, just by saying, oh, I have faith that my conclusion is correct. In Buddhism, since this is a practice that we ourselves are investing in, faith is important. And we can get some faith or some confidence through reading and coming to an intellectual understanding. and saying, oh, that makes sense. It makes sense that I suffer because of this. It's a sort of rational confidence, but it can also help to have a more emotional confidence or faith that comes from seeing people who have engaged in this practice and seeing how they behave, seeing how they respond to life. This direct contact with a living person is also very important in helping us to have faith or confidence that anything the Buddha said is useful, right? If we just had books, we can only know and see so much. Books, words, they're dead. A living person can embody the insight of Buddhism. That can bring us a lot of confidence, which will then allow us to practice diligently. As for which sutra seems to relate to modern scientific theories, well, from what I've seen of quantum physics and some theories about the nature of phenomena, where there are certain particle theories that show that the smallest physical phenomenon, these particles that are invisible, we haven't even been able to see through instruments, that according to some quantum physics theories, even the tiniest particle is not an object. It's not a thing in itself, but it could be in the form of a particle. It could be in the form of a wave. So it has no individual permanent self nature, right? The smallest, tiniest thing has no separate, permanent uh, state to it. And this theory is very similar to the teaching of emptiness in Buddhism, which just says that anything and everything, from the largest thing to the smallest thing, comes about because of many different conditions. There's no permanent, separate self about it. When conditions are favorable, this seeming thing comes into being. When conditions are not favorable, that phenomenon doesn't exist. So ourselves, our human life is like that. Our human life comes about because of many different physical components, our parents, society, the world providing us nutrition, and our psychological phenomenon and spiritual phenomenon are also conditions that make up a human being. Within our human being, although every day we say the word I and this is myself and this is me today and me tomorrow, Buddhism says that this I or this me, this idea that there's something permanent somewhere inside of us that's the same every day, that is a misperception. There's no such thing. We are just a constantly changing collection of conditions. So the teaching of emptiness is we are empty of self, and every phenomenon in the world is empty of self. It's just a product of many different conditions. And I think that seems similar to some of these quantum physics theories